This is IVP.
Have you heard about the new monthly book club from InterVarsity Press? IVP Book Drop is the perfect club for readers who want to grow spiritually, hear from diverse voices, and start powerful conversations on today's most important cultural topics. Plus, it's only $9.99 each month. When you join IVP Book Drop, you'll receive our best-selling title, Reading While Black by Esau McCaulley, as your very first book. And after that, you'll continue to receive one curated book a month for just $9.99. As a listener of the Disruptors podcast, you already know many of the diverse authors featured, like Esau McCaulley, and you'll meet even more authors like them each month. IVP Book Drop is the easiest and most affordable way to receive the latest IVP books from your favorite authors. To learn more and join today for only $9.99, visit ivpress.com/disrupt22. That's ivpress.com/disrupt22. Save big on books worth talking about by signing up for IVP Book Drop today.
Dr. Jemar Tisby, historian, speaker, and author of The Color of Compromise and How to Fight Racism, including a new young adult version. I am so excited to be talking to him as I've been following his work and being inspired by it in my own journey. So welcome.
I am thrilled to be back and so honored to interact with you. Thank you for having me.
You might be the first guest that I've interviewed that Esau also has interviewed, my esteemed predecessor host, Esau McCaulley, and you had an excellent conversation. It was about theology, what it means to be a Black Christian. I especially was taken by how the two of you talked about how to be a Black Christian in a predominantly white space.
Right.
And you mentioned especially one either burns out, sells out, or gets pushed out. And all three of those scenarios resonated with me as an Asian American Christian in my previous white evangelical Christian institution. So.
Wow.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, and is that something from personal experience?
So I think many people of color who have been in these predominantly white, particularly Christian and evangelical spaces, know it's really, really hard, at least if you want to speak up about racism and kind of move the needle on those topics. So what I've observed through personal experience as well as seeing others is in those contexts, typically, if you keep raising these issues, one of three things, or as you said, all three things could happen. You either get pushed out, burn out, or sell out. So the sellout part is kind of like you throw your hands up and you say, it is what it is. I'm just going to keep my head down and not worry about it. Or you actually adopt the ideology that is so oppressive and unhelpful. You get pushed out, meaning you're the squeaky wheel, and they get sick of it and they find a way to make sure you exit, whether that is you voluntarily stepping down because conditions have become so untenable and unbearable, or they sort of give you an ultimatum or make it very clear that, you know, you're not welcome here, or at least you won't advance much or change much here. Or you get burnt out, which I think a lot of people are feeling right now, that you don't give up. You're there for your constituents in the cases of colleges and universities. You're there for the students, the other faculty members, and you want to make the environment better. But it is so hard. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Administrators or alumni or trustees not supporting you. The slightest gesture at racial progress getting so much pushback. And over time, you get so stressed out. There's physiological manifestations. You can't sleep. You're not eating well. You don't exercise. And then the spiritual aspect of it, where you get so soul weary, and it really leads to really, really bad outcomes in a number of areas. But that's what we're up against.
Oh my goodness. I'm just reminded of when I decided to say yes to Ivy Press to host this podcast, and I was still at my previous conservative Christian institution, and I couldn't sleep. Like you said, I had nightmares. I literally actually had to have a God moment where I had God speaking to me and telling me I was going to be fine, for me to stop worrying, because I can't be on a podcast and not be myself.
Right.
And so I had this tension. If I'm going to speak truth about racism, I am going to get in huge trouble with my institution, or at least get pushback, right? That was like you said, the kind of burnout, the constant either ignoring or actually, saying that I'm doing something wrong. And that was essentially what had happened eventually. But I think that was part of my journey. And then the sellout is complex, because I definitely feel like I can't say that I didn't compromise or kept my mouth shut in certain situations where I'm like picking my battles. But the sellout thing is also when you realize that other co-ethnics or other people of color are sellouts around you, and they're not your allies in situations. So if I'm speaking up, like there were so many faculty of color groups, or I think there was an Asian American event that I was in with all Asian Americans, and I wanted to do something for the students. And instead of getting support, people were like, but what is the establishment going to think about that?
Wow.
And they basically were this mob and came after me.
Goodness.
And that was actually one of the reasons why I thought, well, I can't even help others like myself, because they don't want to be helped, because essentially they're selling out to survive, right?
That's right. Harriet Tubman, there's a quote attributed to her that goes something like, I freed 100 slaves, and I would have freed 100 more if they knew they were slaves. That kind of gets to it. I think, again, let's be gracious to ourselves. Like, we're in environments and institutions where we have to survive. We have to get a paycheck. We have to have some productive work to do, and we can't fight all the battles all the time. So some compromise, some choosing your battle, that goes with the territory in any case, right? But it also gets to a point, or maybe you're even entering at this point, where maybe you aren't that far in sort of your racial identity development, which is something I talk about in How to Fight Racism, that you're not quite aware of these dynamics in particular ways. And there are a lot of people, even adults, who are in the phase of basically saying, you go along to get along, that I will minimize my racial, my ethnic, my cultural identity and sort of assimilate into this broader culture. And that's going to help me get ahead. That's going to help me fit in and make friends. That's going to help me have professional success, all of those things, which is, again, a survival mechanism, but it's also uninformed. And sometimes it's fear-based. The fear of, if I do embrace this aspect of how God made me and who I am, how might it disrupt, as we're on the Disruptors podcast, right? How might it disrupt the status quo, and what might that mean for me? So I understand it, but it is also, to your point, extremely frustrating when people who inhabit that experience aren't allies with you in pushing back against an unjust status quo.
Yeah, and the disruption is coming at a huge cost if people have friendship circles or even family circles where, if they're in a whatever friend, family that's multiracial, or even adopted situations where they actually will be coming head to head with people that they love.
Exactly. And
so embracing that aspect of you means having to fight those who you are the closest to. And I feel like my circle of trust at the institution shrank over the years, where I think for my final kind of goodbye, I was like, I only have a handful of people that I want to. Yeah. My criteria of choosing people to be with was, can I be absolutely myself with them?
Yes.
and that became like 5 or 6 people or something. And
our stories are so similar. It's actually refreshing for me to hear that because over time, because of the betrayals, because of the hurt, I have had to be much more selective and about my friends and who I let get really close. And there's a certain grief that goes along with that because I think there was an innocence there. And there's certainly relationships that I wish I still had, but know that I can't because they're not healthy. And so sometimes I'm wondering, am I being too defensive, too critical? And I'm sure there is that to a certain degree, but it comes with the territory. You can't be vulnerable with everyone, especially as you try to speak up for justice. But I mean, to your point about relationships, potentially jeopardizing relationships for your stand for truth, I'm just reminded of the passage where, people come to Jesus as your family's looking for you. And Jesus said, who's my family? Who are my father? Who's my mother and my sister and my brothers? And it's anyone who does the will of God. And to me, that is an oasis in a sort of social desert that our families, even our biological families, we might be estranged from if they're holding on to really unhealthy beliefs about truth, about people, about race. But what God does is says you're knit into a new family of faith, and that your family, your deepest family, is your spiritual family, the ones who do the will of God. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now are a lot of people who said they were part of the spiritual family of God, but aren't really doing the will of God in the area of race and racism. And so then there's this separation that has to come, this distancing, but also the note of hope that there are people out there who are dedicated to this. And they may not be related to you biologically, but they can be our family. So I hope that for everyone who's listening.
That's encouraging, especially if we believe that the church is a real entity and that we can find other people who, and it doesn't have to be even other Christians, right, that you can feel safe with. I definitely have sociology friends who aren't believers, but we get each other in other ways, and they respect my faith, right?
Absolutely.
And even I think reflect a lot of the same characteristics of kindness and empathy and care and justice. Wanting to see justice in the world. So I want to talk about your open letter. I read it when it first came out and thought, oh my gosh, this is such truth. And then I listened to it. I didn't realize it was an audio, and I listened to it and I thought, this is like church. This is like Sunday wisdom. So on May 18th, you're welcome. Thank you for writing it and sharing it. So this was released May 18th of just this year, right? You wrote an open letter to the Board of Trustees at Grove City College, which I looked up. They are a self-described conservative Christian college, because even my previous institution, I don't think, uses the word conservative. And you talk about that in the letter, about how they kind of insert that intentionally. Can you say a little bit more about that letter?
So Grove City College, it was a whole saga. Someone in their diversity department invited me to speak all the way back in October of 2020. This is a very fraught time. It's literally weeks before the 2020 election, which the former president would later claim was stolen. This is Western Pennsylvania. It's heavy Trump country. I fly in, I believe, to Pittsburgh, and I drive to the campus, and I'm seeing sign after sign after sign, and I'm starting to get a sense of what the context is like. But I get to campus, and generally I have good experiences, particularly with students and faculty. This was a little more tense than usual, and there was some pushback when students were doing Q&A and whatnot, but, nothing terribly dramatic. I preached at chapel. It was on justice. It was Esther for such a time as this. It wasn't particularly forceful, but in that context, it was probably new and pretty jarring to people. Came back, praise God, thought nothing else of it and moved on. A year later, there was a petition called Save GCC from CRT. Save Grove City College from Critical Race Theory. And in it, they said that Grove City College was drifting from its gospel mission because of the infiltration of ideas like critical race theory. And then they cited me and my chapel message as evidence of that. Well, longer story short-ish, they formed a subcommittee on the Board of Trustees to investigate these charges of mission drift. They came up with a report that said it was, quote, a mistake to invite me to speak at chapel. That report was officially accepted and adopted by the full Board of Trustees without any revisions. So now it is on official record at the Board of Trustees level that it was a mistake to invite me. So that's why I spoke up and wrote this letter. I don't typically do that. Everywhere I go on Christian colleges and campuses, there's some pushback, but it's usually an individual or a small group. This rose to an official statement by the college's leaders. So I felt compelled to respond, and I wrote this open letter, partly because we have to tell our stories, y'all. For a long, long time, I did not speak about the racist experiences I had among Christians and in those institutions, whether it was church, seminary, or in this case, a college. Out of respect for those institutions, out of respect for the household of God. And I didn't want to sort of appear as gossiping or drawing attention to myself or anything like that. But what I realized over time is if we don't tell our stories, then they can continue their really unhealthy, traumatic, abusive behavior in some cases. The malpractice is allowed to continue. The other thing I realized is my silence could convey to other people of color that these institutions were safe because they didn't know. I didn't say anything. So they don't know anything different other than what the brochure says or the website says, right? So I began speaking up publicly about these things and writing things like this open letter to hold the institution accountable, not because I hate it, but because I want it to be better. And two, so that other people of color don't have to find out the hard way like so many of us do.
Yeah, a lot of my colleagues of color and white women left the university this year, and almost all of us left for very similar reasons that you experienced so much racism and kind of both personal and public pushback in very painful ways. But they can't say anything because they don't want to burn those bridges. And I think that it's so important for someone like you, who's not beholden to Christian higher ed, to be able to shine a light on that, because there is so much fear, right? And I also, because I've exited, I've actually exited academia altogether because not because I necessarily hated academia, but I just could not, I could not survive in an institution where I couldn't be myself. And also I felt like morally was like, you talked about mission drift, and that's their words, right? Like, what is their mission?
Right,
if fighting justice is a drift from their mission, are they just admitting that their mission is white Christian nationalism? I mean, that is essentially their mission, right? And so the drift part, I just don't get it. Why is fighting racism, or not even fighting? It's not even like, I don't think we're very violent in our rhetoric. It is literally just like, hey, there's so much pain and there's so much injustice that's happening. It's just naming the issue.
You got
is somehow a drift from their mission. That just that makes me so upset, because why did I even buy into a faith that would are we talking about the same faith here?
Exactly.
Right? I don't think we are.
Exactly. And that is what is most pernicious, I believe, about white Christian nationalism, is that it is so common that people don't recognize it as something different from the Christianity of Christ, from the religion of Jesus, right? Because it is so baked into the teachings of their churches, the books that they read, the pastors they listen to, as well as the institutions. And that's part of the issue. Many of these Christian institutions, whether denominations, colleges, nonprofits, did not have a thought about racial justice or equity at their founding. And sometimes to the extent that they did think about race, it was the exact wrong thing. It was segregationist, you know. And so roots bear fruit. And so the founding of these institutions has a lot to do with their approaches to race today, such that, as you were talking, and absolutely accurate in saying, what is the mission if talking about justice constitutes mission drift? What happens is these institutions have created themselves has formed their identities as upholding a status quo, which is generally about growth, people and dollars, whether churches or colleges or whatever. And not that they don't do good work. Obviously, there's nuance here, but they're not equipped institutionally to take meaningful and effective action around justice without drastic change. Typically, that change comes at too high a cost for them to want to invest in.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I taught at a conservative Christian university in Southern California, and statistics show that most universities, are enrolled with students that are within a certain mileage radius, right? So Southern California is a very, very non-white community, predominantly, Asian, Latino, Latinx, Black, and not, predominantly white. And certainly the population demographic change is shifting to, I think California is predominantly actually Latino as a state. And so having really no one to actually come to a university that essentially will not welcome any kind of discussions because we can't even name our identity because somehow that's threatening, right? It isn't just like you mentioned in your letter, like they use CRT as an umbrella term to include you as a historian, naming the historical truths that you spent years, decades researching. They name that as CRT. They name me just tweeting about Asians in Hollywood as CRT. It's just like a catch-all for anytime we even bring up positive things about our own groups, or just saying that I'm Asian American is a threat to white Christian nationalism. And so, like you said, it's if it's about enrollment, but for my university, my previous institution, it really is no longer even about keeping afloat. It really is. It's like we will die on this quote unquote mission.
Yes, to your point, are we even talking about the same religion? And if one of the things that I try to constantly do is just make people aware there's other ways to practice Christianity. There's other ways to hold this religion. And in my research, I particularly highlight the Black Christian tradition because in the U.S. context, it is a religious tradition that arose directly to challenge racism and white supremacy. It's important to note that the Black church didn't arise primarily out of any sort of doctrinal disputes about, the place of the Bible or the divinity of Jesus or things like that. It arose because Black people were being treated as second-class citizens in the household of God. As a matter of fact, going to church became a way of monitoring and supervising and controlling Black people. And so it was a very basic desire that said, look, we understand we're made in God's image. We understand we're human and God loves us just like you. We shouldn't be treated like this. And if you won't treat us the way we deserve in your space, we have to create our own space. What we would now start to call building our own tables kind of a thing. But as you look at the Black Christian tradition, and particularly, broadly speaking, teachings about race and racial justice, you find a very different witness to what it means to follow Jesus, to live the faith, and to work for justice. And it's way past time that we sit at the feet of people of faith and others, as you said, who have lived at the margins and have experienced oppression and therefore see the world in a different way and learn from them.
Yeah, and I think there's a lack of acknowledgement that in these predominantly white, but even the multicultural Christian spaces, that white culture is at play. Right. I think about how a guest from last season, Jean Luen Yang, who is a comic book artist and MacArthur Fellow, he mentioned that he thought that Asian American churches were a way to be able to continue the culture without the suspicion of the white establishment.
Wow.
Right? And so acknowledging that in every church there is a culture, and that there's nothing necessarily wrong with, being an Asian Christian, because I think that was a critique that, I can't be Asian and Christian at the same time.
Right.
But they're not acknowledging that the Christian that they're defining is white Christian, right? And so this is the normalization of whiteness so that it becomes invisible. And so when they say identity politics or victim politics, they're always talking about people of color. But in fact, that is completely at play in white Christian nationalism. They're just not acknowledging it.
You bring up such an important point, and for the listeners who are white, this is a critical understanding that race and identity are always at play. White supremacy thrives on invisibility in certain cases. And here's an example. So Daniel Hill is a white pastor in Chicago, and he wrote the book White Awake. And he talks in the book about how he began to understand his own racial identity as a white man in the U.S. And he said he officiated the wedding of a friend of his who was, I believe, of Southeast Indian descent. And he went to this wedding, and they were dressed in all their traditional clothing and music and everything. And Daniel said to his friend, who was the groom, he said, "Oh man, this is so cool. I wish I had a culture like you did." To which his friend responds, "Daniel, you do have a culture. You just don't see it. And it's white culture. And you don't see it because it's the default."
And now, deeper thoughts on whiteness with Nancy Wang Yuen.
Today I read from Daniel Hill's book, White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. Chapter 1, The Day I Discovered My World Was White. I had no idea how much was packed into that little statement, but it sure wasn't lost on him. He suddenly got serious, placed his hand on my shoulder, and looked me straight in the eye. "Daniel, you may be white, but don't let that lull you into thinking you have no culture. White culture is very real. In fact, when white culture comes into contact with other cultures, it almost always wins. So it would be a really good idea for you to learn about your culture." I found myself revisiting this conversation often. My friend was known for avoiding serious topics, so I had been surprised by the spontaneous intensity he had displayed. Most unsettling about it was his commentary on my quote-unquote white culture. First of all, I felt like he was lumping me in with every other white person he'd ever known. I thought, he can't seriously think there's just one white culture, can he? In an attempt to piece together the confusing message he sent my way, I reflected on the Irish heritage on my father's side and the pride many of my relatives took in it. Then I thought about the German and French heritage on my mom's side. I knew less about those cultures, but still they were three very different backgrounds. Was he suggesting that those three distinct cultures could be mashed into a single category white? That seemed like a major stretch. Then there was the even more unsettling suggestion that my culture wins whenever it comes in contact with another. Not only was he lumping all white cultures into a single group, he was also proposing that the single conglomeration consistently dominates other cultures. How would this not come off as insulting to a white person? What seemed utterly obvious to him was utterly confusing to me, but I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I searched for where I could find agreement with him. I could readily acknowledge that some white individuals exhibit dominant or even racist behaviors. Certainly that was common ground. But even then, I found myself thinking, just because certain white individuals demonstrate prejudice or racism by their behaviors doesn't implicate an entire race. I guessed that he would respond poorly to the suggestion that certain individuals of Indian heritage represent their entire race. Yet he seemed comfortable with the idea of poorly behaved white individuals representing all white people. This monologue continued to live inside my head longer than expected, and I anxiously awaited its end. Instead, it grew in intensity. I wasn't sure why, but it was becoming clear that God had provoked something in me through this brief encounter. My friend had opened a monumental door and had left me to decide whether or not to step through it. He had opened me up to a whole new world.
That was Deeper Thoughts on Whiteness with Nancy Wang Yuen.
And this is how white supremacy manifests itself. We tend to think of that term, white supremacy, Ku Klux Klan, bombings and things like that. Yes, that's part of it. But here's another way it manifests. It says that white is right, white is normal, white is standard. So the example I always give, when I went to seminary, all theology was just theology until it was black theology or Asian American theology. When it's European theology or written by white men, it's standard. So you didn't need to label it. And that's the way our entire culture functions. So when we're talking about Asian American churches, black churches, not assimilating, what we're talking about is being in environments where we're not always assuming that white is the standard or the default, but that it can be among other races, cultures, and ethnicities.
Yeah, the supremacy is that truth with a capital T and classics or whatever. It's the canon, right? The canon is always European, always male. And anything else has to have, like you said, the kind of descriptor and the descriptor makes it less than.
Right. Exactly.
And this is all constructed, right, to reinforce the power hierarchy, because we don't need to necessarily think of Asian American studies or African American studies or all these other studies or history with the same kind of ethnic descriptor, that this is American history. I mean, your whole book, The Color of Compromise, is the founding of this country. The kind of it actually, I think, describes our country better than any of the kind of public school, whatever, founding fathers literature that high schoolers. I think every year we learn in public school, right? Every year we learn about the same founding fathers and
George
the Revolutionary
Washington.
War.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
but and then slavery is like maybe 1 month. The Japanese incarceration is one paragraph. So all these kind of are. And this is the anti-CRT movement, right? Is getting the history of colonization, slavery, enslavement, and racism, getting that out of our schools. That is that's not CRT, as you've mentioned in your open letter. We know, as people who study race and racism but don't do CRT because we're not legal scholars. It's so funny because when the anti-CRT movement, especially sweeping through Christian institutions, I was like, man, I should have, I was at UCLA with Kimberly Crenshaw and I didn't audit any of her classes. I want to know more about CRT. When they're attacking me, I feel like I don't even do that. Like, how do I need to learn more myself so that I can defend it better? And and also I should have learned CRT. It's like, because most sociologists actually don't do CRT because it's actually sociology. This is like slicing it in a way that's, the people on the left talk about it. Sociology is actually not seen as the most radical discipline because we're all about data and, it's not about, any kind of opinions. It has to be, obviously everything is, still through a specific perspective, but when people, in Christian institutions label me as a radical, I'm like, I am not as radical as you think, I'm just kind of normal sociologist. I think I've become more radicalized. It's like when you're pushed and when you're labeled, you start to investigate things. It's like I think about, okay, why did God have me go to a conservative Christian institution? And I think I wouldn't have investigated the intersection of white supremacy and evangelicalism the way that I did unless I was at an institution that pretty much told me what I wasn't. Yeah. People telling me I'm not Christian. And then me having to investigate, why are you saying that? Why are you labeling that? And I think that if I were just at, an average, research institution and just going to church, I don't know if I would have thought about it in that deep a way because you're not thinking about it when you're just going Sunday. 100%. I think I accepted that, okay, there's always going to be racists in Christian churches, whatever. And I might have just kind of stepped away from the faith altogether, especially post-Trump. But because of the constant constant investigation and meditation and learning about liberation theology and other ways of thinking about the gospel. I'm thankful, I think, that I was able to, through the fire, through the persecution, actually come out and feel like, gosh, I know stuff now, and I can be confident in my faith, more confident than if I just was confused why, evangelicalism became the ugly thing that it became.
I will say in college, sociology was one of my favorite classes. I feel this kinship, and I learned so much from sociologists. But for me, studying history had that similar effect of, yes, of course, I came to faith in a white evangelical context, which is baffling because even the area where I lived wasn't predominantly white. So it's just the way God wove that story. And it was being in that context that sort of forced these questions about race and identity and theology and whatnot. And I, too, have experienced such seasons of frustration and pain that I don't know where I would have ended up. But I think God also used history to help guide me, because history does a couple of things. Number one, it gives an accurate witness. You see, we can say all these beautiful things about what we believe, but it's how we live that truly communicates what we believe about God and other people. How we live truly communicates our theology. So I was able to see through history what many people in this country really meant when they said Christian or evangelical. And it was often wrapped up in ideas of white supremacy and racial superiority and all of those things. But the other thing it did was say there was another witness. So we often hear in historical studies, they were men of their times, typically speaking of people behaving badly, like slaveholders. And it's weaponized to basically say, you can't judge them. You can't cast a moral judgment on what they did. We didn't live when they did. They're men of their time. To which I say, Frederick Douglass was a man of his time. Ida B. Wells was a woman of her time. People who stood up against racism and white supremacy were people of their time as well. So the reality is we cannot give people a moral pass just because they lived in a different era. Sure, the sort of culture might have been different, but right within that were people who were pushing back against an unjust status quo, and we have to heed their voices too. And as a matter of fact, if we learn to do that in looking at history, perhaps we can learn to do that in looking at the present day as well. Yeah,
that's so true. That pass. Well, I mean, we give passes for so many reasons. Oh, boys will just be boys. I mean, whatever they were saying when Trump's, tape came out about all those horrible things, misogynistic and really rapey things that he was saying. Like, somehow that got a pass. I mean, everything that he got a pass for, and the fact that evangelical Christians got behind him, I think that was such a bad witness.
Yes.
to the world. Really, that was probably the worst witness possible. And, people were trying to be quote unquote good by not abstaining from voting, right? That was a lot of the white evangelicals were somehow they were morally superior because they were just going to abstain from voting. But I was like, by abstaining, you're still like, when you do nothing, that is still doing something, right? And anyhow, so just the fact that I think that really emboldened a lot of people to tell lies about Christianity and Christian faith, wrapped up in that politicization. And I think, I know so many people who walked away from the faith and at least walked away from evangelicalism since then. And I think that a lot of the listeners of the Disruptors are part of that camp or thinking about what does this all mean. And I don't know, you mentioned that we're in the kind of the civil rights movement of our times, right? That, I mean, especially all this kind of pushback on CRT. That's right. When nobody knows what CRT means, these people, and you're doing a series, and it's wonderful, called "Those Meddling Kids Unmasking the Anti-CRT Crusade," especially specifically in Christian higher ed. And this is you're interviewing experts. Say a little more about that.
So I was able to do a Zoom call with some students at Grove City, and these are the students who actually want to see racial change and progress, which, by the way, the student body's 90% white. And then when it comes to faculty and staff, it's like 94% white. So there's a lot of more understanding that needs to happen. And so these students, which was actually a racially and ethnically mixed group, were interested in finding out ways to keep the momentum because, again, silence supports the status quo. So I'm sure what many of the leaders at Grove City wanted to happen was, this stuff happened late spring, so let's just get to summer break and then folks will stop talking about it and we can move on. We didn't want that to happen. We wanted this to force an issue so that there would be change and progress. And so one of the things we came up with was it was originally going to be a teach-in, just a one-day thing, but there was so much to cover that it expanded into a series. And so this series, those meddling kids, is sort of that phrase is a play on Scooby-Doo, right? The cartoons, where the young people would spend the whole episode solving a mystery, and at the end, when they figured it out, they would unmask the villain or the culprit, and invariably that person would say, "And I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for those meddling kids." And that's actually a compliment, right? This is about young people who want to agitate for positive change. And so we did this series, talked to all kinds of experts on critical race theory, white Christian nationalism, what I call the anti-CRT industrial complex, talking about, the web of money and institutions that supports all this. It really turned out, I'm so pleased with it, and the information contained there, I think is going to be helpful for anyone who wants to understand what on earth is going on with how did critical race theory become this boogeyman in our culture and what's really behind it. And I'll say this about the critical race theory stuff, which is really, really scary because a couple of things are happening. One, state legislatures are passing laws banning what they call critical race theory, which, as you said, is really simply making it harder for us to speak and teach honestly about our racial past and present. And then the second thing that's happening is these far-right activists are taking over local school boards, such that in local communities and local schools, it'll get harder and harder to have access to the books and the teachings and all of this. And you can just look online. There's these onerous requirements of teachers having to go through literally every single book in their library and make sure it checks these really amorphous, ambiguous boxes of not teaching CRT. I'll say what's behind that. I think two of the primary drivers behind that are, one, things like critical race theory, and they point to projects like the 1619 Project specifically, which isn't critical race theory either, but doesn't matter to them. But anyway, any teaching that disrupts the narrative of this innocent founding of the nation, because many people think that America is God's favorite country. The United States is the apple of God's eye. And sure, there were some issues around Native Americans and slavery, but you know what? We got over it. And that just shows that can-do American spirit. And the founding fathers weren't thinking about those things. They were thinking about freedom and democracy and liberty. And any teaching that would undermine that is forbidden. That's one thing. The other thing is a misunderstanding of really any sort of racial justice theory today. The misunderstanding is that some people think these teachings are saying that all white people are inherently racist, literally by virtue of being white or by the amount of melanin they have in their skin. What people are saying, what activists are saying, what theories like critical race theory communicate is that racism and white supremacy is the default, and that even apart from your active intention, you can passively participate in an unjust system. Which, I don't know if this jives, but this is what I think about. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, they had a sacrifice for the unintentional sins of the people, which says you can be wrong and not even know it. So I wonder if there might be a similar application to where you can be participating in an unjust system, a racist system, not be conscious of it, but it's still hurting people. It's still violating the image of God in people. And so what critics of critical race theory think is that this theory is saying that all white people are just bad because they're white, just racist because they're white. What these theories are saying is that apart from an intentional effort to go against the status quo, apart from an intentional effort to be actively anti-racist, in the common terminology today, that you're propping up a status quo that is very harmful, and that's what it's saying.
I think they just don't want to accept that the status quo is racist.
That's right.
They don't accept that premise at all, and that is despite the data. Right. This is the whole like truth. So ironic that they're after truth, but they will ignore hard data, and that is actually truth that is collected by social scientists.
Right.
I've been very hard pressed to continue. I realized recently, actually, and I hope that you can help me with this, Jemar, because even though I actually came to faith through Asian American Christians, right? And actually, even before then, I've shared this, I think, on previous episodes of The Disruptors. The first time I was born in Taiwan. I came when I was 5. I didn't know about God at all. My family is not even agnostic, just a religion, a faith, I guess. No, they didn't think about anything. And there's no mention of God in Taiwan pop culture because it's not that kind of country, right? And so the first time I heard about God was watching Different Strokes, the 1980s sitcom. Yeah. It was Arnold praying to God about heaven, he was worried that, Mr. Drummond was going to die. It was some sort of, hijinks, misunderstanding. But the premise of the show is that his parents, died and he's an orphan, right? Yeah. And so I was really drawn to that. And then when he talked about God and was praying, I was like, and that jump-started my spiritual journey. So it was, a black boy, fictional, praying. And then I was in Southern California, and I only had Asian American friends. So it was like through all these, like I went to Catholic church with my Filipino friend, and it was a Korean Jesus camp where I was saved. And so I had a very Asian, non-white Christian experience. But my 14 years at my white Christian national institution, I have a hard time praising God these days because I think I cannot get out of my mind the God that I cannot remember the God I once worshipped. I am brainwashed against my will about the white Christian kind of national. I mean, because there was literally like a huge mural in my university of a white Jesus. I can't. 14 years had an impact on me because I was so busy resisting white evangelicalism. I am having a hard time, confession, of wanting to praise the God of my youth, the God. This is emotional for me, right? Like the God that I had come to because I was interested in the God of love, but this horror that has been, just also coming to realize, like you said, the disruption of coming to realize that the faith that you once held, or that you maybe still hold as important and significant, but all the racism and all the homophobia and all the sexism and the misogyny and horrors that have become synonymous with it, I cannot be immune to that. And I'm having a hard time. How do you, as someone who's trying to decolonize, what do you do? What do you do when you're coming out of a white situation?
That's right.
How do you still love and worship the God of creation?
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing so candidly. I think a lot of people are going through that, and I absolutely identify with that. To be honest with you, to this day, I have a hard time reading the Bible because all of my Bible study tools, all of my hermeneutical tools came out of these very harmful, racially harmful white contexts. And so I don't know if I can trust the way I've been taught to interpret the Bible if those tools have led to all of these bad teachings and abuses and fears, right?
Exactly, yes.
So I'm like, I still don't quite know, but a couple of things have helped. Number one, decolonizing, use that word, and I'm glad that you did, because a lot of the conversation now is about, quote unquote, deconstructing the faith. For many of us, especially people of color, it's not about turning our backs on God or coming up with a completely different religion. It's about taking away the colonialist, imperialist, racist elements that we've been taught, and finding out what's left then. So it is a process of decolonizing our faith. How does that happen? One, it's never been easier to listen and learn from other Christians. Particularly in the pandemic era, we had to pivot, and we did virtual church and online stuff. You can still do that now. And so how hard would it be on your commute, your run, your whatever, to listen to sermons or Bible studies or teachings from people of color, from communities that you haven't typically listened to? You're going to get a very different tone, a very different expression of the faith, which might be refreshing. Another thing that's helped me is understanding that God speaks through all of creation. And without getting into, sort of all the authority of the Bible and all of those things, all I'm saying is I can learn about God through all of creation. And what's been particularly helpful to me is learning about history and learning about people who lived their lives in terms of a faithful witness to justice. And seeing, oh, no, there are real people who did this. And they offer me a different example than so many of the folks that I see now, especially the ones that make the headlines, unfortunately. The other thing, again, I said this before, is giving grace to ourselves, that we've been hurt, that what we're experiencing is confusing, that it took time for us to sort of get stuck in this morass. It's going to take time for us to get unstuck. And God's timeline is probably different from yours, that the way God is healing you is going to be a deep, deep healing. It is not going to be shallow or surface, but God wants us to go through a process, which is not to excuse the harm that's done, but to say that if it takes time, and it will, that it's going to be a stronger healing than if we could just snap our fingers and have it all figured out. And let's do it together. Like, wherever you're listening, you're not the only one who is feeling sort of displaced or in the wilderness, as we often say. Listen to this podcast. We've addressed similar topics in my podcast, Pass the Mic. Read these authors. Find your community, your spiritual family, or your chosen family, which might be virtual in some cases. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing.
Who would you recommend to listen to in terms of preachers of color who are, who can actually address some of these very wide, I think, concerns for, folks that, I agree, the deconstruction. I'm not against deconstruction, but I like I'm always decolonizing, but decolonizing the faith, right? I love that. So are there decolonizing pastors that we can listen to?
Absolutely. The ladies of Truth's Table, Ekemini Uwan and Christina Edmondson, grab their book, which is astoundingly insightful, but also their podcast, and they're doing like daily Bible reading, so you can get a lot from them. My co-host on my podcast, Tyler Burns, is also a pastor, New Dimensions or All Nations Fellowship in Pensacola. His sermons are online. He's an incredibly gifted preacher. He'll never admit that, but he can't. It's obvious the moment you hear him. And he's in a Black church context, and just from the topics he chooses to the illustrations he uses, very, very different. A book that I constantly revisit is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. Just a beautifully mystic, very spiritual, very soulful, cerebral, but really getting through the emotions and the heart, treatment of justice from a faith standpoint. And then literally books about people who have lived well. So I think of Fannie Lou Hamer. There are a few biographies of her out recently. As much as we mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., who's actually sat down and read an actual biography of his life? That'll give you a whole different dimension than the one quote from his "I Have a Dream" speech. So
Or all the quotes that circulate
exactly
on Martin Luther King Day from even conservatives who like to cut out all the radical parts of his ministry.
The colorblind. Love to interpret him as colorblind, which he never was.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So those are
Awesome.
some, and there's other people to learn from, like yourself. I'm learning a whole bunch from. Get Real Inequality if you haven't yet. What are you waiting for? And then I learned from folks like Bree Newsom, Bernice King, William Barber. Like there's people actively living right now who are trying to set an example. So there's no shortage. One of my favorite answers to a lot of these questions is just 2 words long. Google it. I promise you'll find something.
Awesome. So recently, I'm on this listserv and just, for Netflix multicultural marketing. And they do these previews of like their content that's, featuring historically underrepresented groups. And I was there, and then they have a chat box, right, of all the folks that are invited. I was like, Jemar Tisby. Whoa, this is cool. And so what's going on with you and Netflix and, Hollywood?
I love movies, television, entertainment. This is what surprises some people is like, because I do this race stuff all day, every day. When I actually have leisure time, I don't want to do that. I want to escape. I literally do. I watch silly things. Humor is a balm to my soul. God bless the comedians, sincerely, deeply, from the bottom of my heart. Because if you can make me laugh in this context, in this environment, what we're going through, oh, that's a gift. So anyway, I love good entertainment, and I'm not a critic. Like I don't have that lens. I'm more of a consumer, and I like what I like, and it may not be sophisticated. It is what it is. But I also love just thinking about it through a faith perspective and even a race perspective. I can't actually completely turn that off. So when I do watch these things, I'm very interested in storytelling. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. This is my big public kind of explanation. I don't think I've done this on a podcast before. And if you like it, I need to trademark it. Don't steal it. This is what I say. I say every movement has at least 3 elements: the academy, the assembly, and the arts. Okay. I'm nervous. I haven't completely fleshed this out, but I think there's something there. So the academy, that doesn't just mean like the formal college or university. It means people who give us new knowledge, who give us data and information, oftentimes researchers or scholars or writers, but not always. There's folk wisdom there that we can learn from. But the folks who give us the informational and intellectual material we need to understand our context. So in terms of race, these are the folks who are writing about race and all those kinds of things. We need that. We also need the assembly, by which I mean both faith communities and political processes. So the assembly literally mean where people gather to sort of deliberate and make decisions. Certainly faith communities are a big part of any racial justice movement, for good or for ill, in this country. And so they have to be part of that conversation if we want to see movement. But also because evangelicalism has confined racism to very individualistic manifestations, we have to have the sort of political assembly to change systems and laws and policies. To your question, the arts are where I think we have so much more progress to make in terms of our racial justice efforts. What places like Netflix and Hollywood do fundamentally is tell stories. Mm-hmm. And I love that. It's so powerful. It gets at us in ways that nothing else can. And so I think what we've learned from the far right is that they have a bad story but they tell it really well. They do. They use media really effectively, and they get their people information. Well, forces for progress and justice can learn from that and say, how can we tell stories better in multiple media, whether that's writing, poetry? Think about the January 6th inauguration, not the insurrection, the inauguration, which was later. The most memorable part of that wasn't that Biden won, wasn't that we had our first person of color and woman vice president. That was incredibly memorable. But what people remember about that day was Amanda Gorman reading a poem.
Absolutely.
Because there was something about art and creativity and culture making that captures us in a way that nothing else can. And I just think that if we want to have a civil rights movement today and see it make progress, then we need more storytellers. We need more culture creators doing what they do best in all the different ways that this information and digital age has allowed us to do. So that's my interest.
No, I absolutely agree. That's why I studied Hollywood all of my life or all my adult life. And I see it as, so there's two things I think about it. I think in some ways it's church now for the world because we all share in pop culture in ways that church once functioned, right? So even if you're not a believer, you can be a believer of or fandom, right, of Star Wars, of whatever it is. Marvel really, I think, has become the dominant quote unquote church, secular church for so many people that even if you don't like it, you know about it,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So because it's a force to be reckoned with. And so I think that at the same time, the arts has been dominated by white supremacy. And this is not because this is exactly what you were saying. You don't have to be conscious of it to do it. Because I think people in Hollywood do not think of themselves as racist. That's been my whole book is about how they talk about color. It's a form of colorblind racism because they will say that they are not racist. They will actually say it's kind of like Get Out, where they're like, I would vote for Obama twice if I could.
Exactly.
That is like almost like 99% of Hollywood, right? The kind of white liberal, industrial complex, if we want to call it that.
Spill all the tea. Yes.
But so actually, when I wanted to leave my institution, my literary agent was like, "You should write about your experience there." And I was like, "I should compare white Christian nationalism to white Hollywood liberals."
Wow.
because I think that there are a lot of similarities. The kind of denial of the institutional racism, the kind of moral, kind of whatever, I don't even know, storytelling. We could call it storytelling, right? They tell a story of their own morality that does not confess, that does not, there's no humility in it, right? There is just kind of and whether it's driven by whatever, all of it is driven by material capitalism.
Yeah.
Even let's just admit it. The churches are about numbers as well, right? But at least in the church, I think the message is more of like gospel or truth or biblical, whatever mission, right? Whatever it is. Hollywood, it's about dollars, box office, right? But all of it are these imagined truths and imagined audiences, right? Imagined. So I thought that we were over it. I really honestly was naive and thought, oh, now studios really get it because I've seen so many changes in my lifetime, right? But HBO just recently, fired most of its executives of color.
Goodness.
and destroyed Batgirl, right? Just for whatever, and which starred a black woman as Batgirl. And so, and all of this kind of, and they're apparently going after quote unquote middle America, this imagined white audience, because like the Gaineses and Discovery, because they're part of Discovery, right? That they want these Waco, Texas makeovers and good old fashioned, I don't know what, Texan decor and storytelling.
Yeah.
And so I had in my book in 2016, my research in the early 2000s kind of taken down the idea that middle America isn't what you think it is. And it's just an excuse for Hollywood to continue to say, well, it's the audience. We're just trying to go after that audience. And I think they're thinking about the Trump audience, right? They're thinking about things like that. And it's so hypocritical, but that's just like the church is so hypocritical, right? This kind of morality that they, anyway, so I could get on that soapbox, but that's what I'm thinking about. And so exactly what you're saying about the arts, it's not just kind of like we can inspire, but we really need to combat the white supremacy that actually gets distributed to everybody with no filter, right? Because people are just, like you said, they're just relaxing. At the end of the day, they just want to relax. They're not watching this at all with a critical eye.
Right.
And that's when these messages get implanted in our brains, especially young people.
Yes.
You know, there's studies that say that like young people of color and all women, like their self-esteems go down with each additional hour of television watched.
My goodness.
And the only group that goes up is white boys, right?
Look at that.
And so psychologically, it's taking a toll. It's a public mental health crisis and a societal crisis in terms of social justice, right? In terms of who we think of as heroes, who we think of as good. And so all of that.
I just have to give you your flowers. This is why I think not just your work, but your whole sort of embodiment is so important. First of all, you represent people of faith who aren't scared of the big bad world out there, particularly entertainment, liberal, what some would call that world, right? And so you can maneuver in that world, faithful to your principles, but loving toward many, 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 many different people. And I think that's such an important witness right now, because there are still so many folks who are committed to building walls between themselves and what they term the world, and it's really scary for them. The other thing that you live and demonstrate is the power and usefulness of scholarship and disciplined research and study, and how you can bring those tools to bear on present day inequalities and social issues that can help us move forward. And to me, that was such an inspiring example, because in the context where I learned the faith, those things weren't promoted. They weren't expressed very often, or at least not very well. And so to hear your deep, deep, deep knowledge of your subject matter, as well as your passion for people and justice and equity, I just want to say it's awesome to observe. I'm so honored that I just even got to speak with you. I hope we can collaborate. We need to get into some good trouble together. There's got to be a project out there we can figure out.
I want to do creative work. Do
Yeah.
you want to do creative work? I want to create the content, because you know, it's not enough for me to just critique it. I need to create some original content with, like, you know, all the, I think that academics who go into Hollywood, they have so much to bring. We need to, that's what we need to do. We need to go in there
100%.
and create content that is informed, right?
Yeah.
Informed by faith, informed by our scholarship, informed by our knowledge of the social justices and the injustices that need to be reformed. And so I think it's intimidating. It's a little intimidating, right? Because I think creative work is not how we were trained, but it's like you said, my whole being has been formed by popular culture, right? My faith was introduced. God chose to reach me through an 80s sitcom.
That
one of
is
the very
amazing.
few that featured kids of color, because I was looking for them subconsciously, right?
Yeah.
I'm like looking for the non-white folks, right? So I mean, I love Lucy, because I was like, there's a guy who speaks with an accent who's not, bad.
Right,
So
right.
all these things, they form us. They really do form us, and I want to help form future generations for good, right? So
I love it. Yes, let's do it.
let's do it. Okay, that's going to be the conclusion of the podcast. Next time you hear from us, we're going to be Hollywood executives.
You said it.
Or we're gonna be on the red carpet, Netflix red carpet, right?
Absolutely. Let's do it. I can't wait.